with Sanim team. Is Dr. Radhika Kapoor online? She's there. Radhika, can you hear me? Dr. Radhika Kapoor, you are there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. This is Selim speaking.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
I
great.
can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. So we are about to start the session. Khosrow bhai?
Good afternoon. I think we'll start the preliminary session now. So if everybody can take your seat, please. Okay, today's plenary session will be on a very important topic, and I believe also very pertinent topic. This is setting the labor market priorities right for Bangladesh. And I think we have a very distinguished list of people who will be presenting, discussing on this issue. We are very fortunate that Tomo Potinianen, I think I pronounced it right, Country Director, International Labor Market, International Labor Organization, ILO. He has agreed to grace the occasion as special guest. We have three distinguished panelists, Dr. Ianuddin Islam, Adjunct Professor, Griffith Asia Institute, Griffith University, Australia. Then Dr. Qazi Iqbal, Research Director, Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, BIDS, and Soed Sultanuddin Ahmed, Executive Director, Bangladesh Institute of Labor Studies. And basically, there will be a presentation by Radhika Kapoor, Fellow Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. So before that, some statistics or some the context for this plenary session is that we all know that in Bangladesh, almost every year, I mean, according to the data, 2.2 million aspirants try to enter the labor market, looking for jobs, okay? And we also know that almost half of them, only half of them get a job. Let us, in terms of, I mean, even if we ignore like decent work or the quality of the work, we know that we can only provide jobs to 50% of the aspirants, okay? So this is a major challenge in the context of Bangladesh. And this is not a recent phenomenon. This is I think, a decade-long phenomenon. We have been trying to do that, but we have been failing to actually provide jobs to these aspirants. And behind that, there are other characteristics which define the labor market challenges in Bangladesh. It includes high youth unemployment, which are almost double of the national average. We have like very low female labor force participation, half of the male participation. Then we have huge gender gap in terms of wage gender gap. And also in terms of worker safety and protection, very weak in Bangladesh in terms of that. And also, we also have these are existing challenges that we know, but there are also emerging challenges that are emerging also. Like one is that with the onslaught of automation, AI, what will be happen to the labor issue, or whether we'll be displacing, more labor in the coming days is also a challenge. And moreover, which we have discussed yesterday, I believe, is that the trade, the Trump administration trade measures, what will be the impact of that on Bangladesh economy? This is still unclear, but I think will be clearer soon. I mean, it may have negative effect, it may have positive effect. So how we are going to tackle this one, at least for the next 4 years, or even more than that, is another emerging challenge. So today, I think we believe that after the presentation, focus presentation, there will be a opportunity to discuss these issues and provide some strategic recommendation that we can actually put forward to address the challenges of the labor market and promote decent work for the new aspirants. With that, I will invite Dr. Radhika Kapoor to present her presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just. Is my presentation visible? Could someone please confirm if my screen is visible and if I'm audible? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the conference organizers for inviting me to speak at this very important session. Just a clarification on my designation. I am with the International Labour Organization. I'm a part of the Decent Work Team for South Asia. On this session the session is titled Setting Labour Market Priorities Right for Bangladesh. The first step in answering this question really entails understanding what the challenges in the labour market are. And that's what the first part of the presentation will seek to do. And then these challenges are placed in a larger macroeconomic context, wherein we look at macroeconomic data in conjunction with the labour market data. And this is important because if we have to set labour market priorities right for Bangladesh, then a central pillar of that exercise will be that employment should not be treated as a residual outcome of the growth process. Rather, it has to be placed very much at the center of the recovery process. And I will explain in more detail what I mean as I go along. So let's start with some initial stylized facts. If you look at the GDP statistics for Bangladesh in the period between 2017 and 2022, and the reason why I pick these years is because when I look at the labor market trends, I will focus on data from the last two labor force surveys, the 2016-17 and the 2022 labor force survey. What we basically see when we look at the GDP data is that growth rates have been fairly robust. They have been above 6%. There was a sharp slowdown during the COVID-19 pandemic, but GDP growth rebounded fairly quickly thereafter, and by 2022, it was about 7%. But if you look at the state of the labor market, the reality of the labor market actually remains quite difficult, and the performance has been weak and uneven. So I'm just going to switch off my camera because it says my connection is a little unstable. Okay. So if we look at the unemployment rates in Bangladesh, and we break these down and look at it across the different demographic groups, what we find is that unemployment rates actually increased across all cohorts, for rural males, for urban females. The only cohort in which we see a decline is actually rural females. The absolute number of unemployed also increased from 2.78 million to 3.39 million. And the unemployment rate at an aggregate level also increased marginally. But of course, that marginal increase from about 4.3% to 4.6% hides the disaggregated sharp increases across certain cohorts, such as the male category or the urban female category. Now, beyond the unemployment rate, if we look at what people are doing to understand what the quality of employment is, what we find is that in the period between 2017 and 2022, there was a very sharp increase in the share of self-employment, in particular in the category of own account work. So total employment in Bangladesh between 2017 and 22 increased from about 60 million to 70 million. That's about close to a 10 million increase in employment. But about 8.5 million of that increase came from the category of own account workers. And by 2022, 50% of all workers were in the category of own account work. If we look at wages now, if we look at mean monthly earnings of paid employees, because that's the category for which you can capture the earnings, what you actually see is that there has been a sharp decline in real wages. And of course, that has also been a consequence of the high inflation, which has eroded real wages. And that has been because of a variety of macroeconomic factors, high costs of energy, food, global supply chain disruptions. But the decline in wages is also a reflection of a deterioration in the quality of employment. Let me now do a deep dive specifically in the category of youth for Bangladesh. And what we find here is that if you actually look at the unemployment rates by age cohort, and here if you look at the bar chart, which is on the top left corner, you find that the unemployment rates for those in the 15 to 24 category, which are defined as the youth, is considerably higher than that for the 25 plus category. And what is more, you actually see a very sharp increase in youth unemployment, a sharper increase compared to the older category of the 25 plus cohort. So the only category where you actually see a decline is the case of rural females, and we'll get into a little bit more detail of that in the next few slides. But there has been a sharp increase in youth unemployment as well, and youth unemployment has been higher than that of the older age cohort. And additionally, I can show that slide later, but in the interest of time, I won't do it right now. But the unemployment rate amongst the most educated has been the highest. It's been somewhere between 35 to 40% if we break down and look at these four cohorts. Along with the unemployment rates, if you actually look at the distribution of employment amongst the youth by the type of work they're doing, this has also shown a marked deterioration. Here too, what you're seeing is that basically there's been a very sharp increase in the share of self-employment. For the youth in 2017, about 44% of the youth was in the category of self-employment, but by 2022, this share had increased to almost 61%. At the same time, the share of the youth who were in the category of paid employment, which is called the employees, that's the top row in the chart that is in this table, that showed a decline of almost 17 percentage points from 55% to 38%. And if you contrast these figures for the 15 to 24 category with the age cohort in the group which is above 25 years, you can see that it is the youth group which has shown a more severe or a marked deterioration in the quality of employment compared to the older group. Now, even when you look at the category of what are called paid employees, this is a very heterogeneous group because it has workers which will have different kind of contracts, access to social security, and so on. So here what I try to do is that if we look at the share of those in paid employment who were in formal jobs, in other words, formal paid employment. If we look at formal paid employment, which can be considered as a good job or decent work. So we look at the proportion of all employed youth in the category of such good jobs, which are the most desirable form of employment in most countries. We see that that share is really quite minuscule. And in fact, not only is it minuscule, but it has actually declined over time. So the share of the youth who are in these so-called good jobs fluctuates anywhere between 1 to 2%, depending on which cohort you are looking at. And as you can see over here, this has also declined over time. And therefore, you can sense that the absence of good jobs for youth explains why there is a strong preference for government jobs in Bangladesh. The next stylized fact I want to highlight, which is really interesting, it links up to some of the trends that we have seen on rural females in the preceding slides, is that we have seen a sharp increase in female labor force participation rates between 2017 and 22. On an aggregate level, the female labor force participation rates have increased from about 36 to 43%. And most of this increase has actually come from the category of rural females. The rural female labor force participation rate has increased from about 38 to 51%, as you can see from this slide. And for young rural females, that is those who are in the 15 to 24 category, the increase has been even sharper from 25 to 63%. Now, this is something which is quite puzzling because we have seen an increase in female labor force participation rate for rural female. At the same time, we have seen that there has been a sharp increase in the share of women, especially rural females who have been engaged in own account work. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, 4.2 million women were added to the labor force between 2017 and 22, and 4.67 million were added to the count of own account workers. So For females, they have entered the labor force, but there's been a shift towards self-employment and there's been a shift towards agriculture. And this raises the question of what actually this increase in female labor force participation rate is capturing. Is this, in fact, a positive trend, which is a natural progression towards gender equality? Or is it, in fact, distress-induced participation in the workforce, which might have been a coping mechanism on account of higher unemployment amongst males or a consequence of a decline in the real income? So this is something which is not clear and perhaps needs to be explored and understood in further detail. Now let's now look at the employment data in conjunction with the GDP data. And this is really quite interesting. If we look at the GDP data between 2016-17 and 22, what we find is that agriculture grew fairly slightly at about 3% per annum. And the sectoral share of agriculture in GDP declined, as you can see, from about 13.6 to 11%. The industry sector, which is a fairly aggregated sector and encompasses things like manufacturing, construction, mining, and so on and so forth, grew at over 8%, barring the year of the pandemic. And as a result of it, its contribution to GDP increased from 33% to about 37%. The manufacturing sector, also in terms of GDP statistics, performed very well. And it was growing at about 11% for most of this time period, barring the year of the pandemic again. And its share in GDP also increased from 21 to close to 25%. But when we look at this movement of the sectoral share in GDP in conjunction with the sectoral share in employment, what we find is the complete opposite trend. We have seen a decline in the share of agriculture in GDP, but when you look at the sectoral share of agriculture in GDP, this in fact has increased. The increase here is about just 1 percentage point, but in absolute terms, 4.4 million people were added to agriculture in the period between 2017 and 22. Industry and manufacturing, strikingly, even though they witnessed a sharp increase in the share of GDP, have seen a decline in the share of employment, as you can see from this table. In absolute terms, industry actually saw a decline of 450,000 workers. And in manufacturing specifically, which is one of the subcomponents of industry, the decline was of 833,000 jobs. Now, this is really quite puzzling because there has been a discussion for a long time, and I caught some of it in the previous panel as well, about how labor displacing technology has created a challenge for job creation, and there have been concerns about jobless growth. But in this case, it's particularly puzzling, but because what we are seeing jobless growth, but in fact, loss growth. As I said, about 800,000 jobs were lost in manufacturing during this, despite manufacturing growing at about 11 to 12%. What is more, most of these job losses were in fact concentrated amongst women. In fact, again, over 800,000 jobs which were lost were in the category of amongst women. And then if you deep dive and do a more disaggregated look within manufacturing, what we find is that it is in the apparel sector, again, where you're seeing a decline in the share, but even in absolute numbers of about 200,000 jobs. So this is something which is deeply plus phenomena of job loss growth in the industrial sector. But more broadly, what's the trends tell us about the reallocation of labor and GDP across sectors is that, as you can see from this graph, labor has in fact moved from high productivity sectors, and this is actually the complete opposite of what we would expect in a Lewisian structural transformation, where labor should be moving from low productivity sectors to high activity sectors. And consequence of this, a consequence of the fact that labor has moved from these high productivity to low productivity sectors, coupled with the fact that GDP growth has actually been faster in high productive sectors, a consequence of these two phenomena is that actually productivity differentials have widened across the economy. So just to give one example to illustrate that, if you look at the last two columns of this table, if you look at the industrial sector, the industrial sector, the share of GVA per worker or labor productivity in the industry sector normalized to the agriculture was about 4.8 in 2016-17. But because of this reversal of structural transformation and flows of labor in the opposite direction, the productivity differential widened, and by 2022, actually the ratio of GVA per worker in the industrial sector to the agricultural sector was 8 times. So this reversal of structural transformation, along with job loss growth in manufacturing, is something which is a cause for concern. Again, just quickly to touch on the structural transformation issue, it has actually been a challenge which has been far more pronounced for the youth. If you see here, the share of youth which have been employed in the agricultural sector has increased sharply from 27 to 41%. Their share in manufacturing has declined from 25 to 14%. And within manufacturing, actually, the share of apparel, which has traditionally been an important source of employment generation, has also declined from 12.5 to about 7.5%. And all of this is from the perspective of youth. There is the absence of non-agricultural employment opportunities. It is apparent from this pattern of structural transformation, particularly in the industrial sector. This, coupled with the earlier trends that I showed you about the lack of good jobs or decent work as defined as formal paid employment, explains once again why there is a very strong preference for government jobs amongst the youth. And another interesting consequence of this sectoral pattern of GDP and employment growth has been that productivity growth has been very rapid. Labor productivity growth has been very rapid in sectors such as manufacturing and industry. You can see about in the industrial sector as a whole, the average annual growth of labor productivity has been 11.5%. But then when that is looked at in conjunction with the growth in real wages, that has been negative. Similarly, in the manufacturing sector, very rapid growth of GVA per worker, but wage growth has actually been negative. Again, what this suggests is that the gains from labor productivity have not been fully shared by labor, and that perhaps the share of labor in gross value added has declined over time. Why this has happened? It could be a confluence of multiple factors: labor market slack, weak bargaining power of workers, technological change, automation, minimum week wage policies, and so on. Now, I've analyzed all these trends looking at the labor market in conjunction with the GDP data. But I think it's also important to highlight over here, as has been the discussion in the white paper on the state of the Bangladesh economy, which was released a few months ago, is that the GDP numbers that I have shown so far, they have been questioned by the white paper committee. And it has been pointed out that actually the GDP numbers may have been higher than or overstated in these statistics, because when the official data is reconciled with other key growth indicators such as trade, credit, nightlight intensity, and so on, there is a disconnect. And the white paper committee, of course, also suggests that growth may have been slowing down, given that the growth numbers may have been overstated. Growth was perhaps slowing down 4 to 5 years even before the pandemic struck. In addition to the concern about the overstating of the growth numbers, it's also worth noting that if you look at the period between 2002 and 2007 in this graph, GDP growth was fairly stable. But if you look at the period post the global financial crisis from 2009 onwards, the GDP growth rate has actually been fairly volatile. So the concerns about growth being overstated, coupled with the volatility in the growth numbers, coupled with the fact that now there is widespread consensus that growth is slowing down. Many international organizations have estimated that growth will come down to 4 and 4.5%, between 4 and 4.5% in FY25, suggests that the challenge in terms of the labor market also is now much more severe. If I may say, it's a twofold challenge. One is of reviving genuine economic growth if the growth numbers are in fact overstated and growth is volatile. And second is reconnecting employment and economic growth to ensure that growth is jobless. Now, this, of course, is a very there are no quick fixes here, and there are no easy answers, particularly given the severe macroeconomic challenges that Bangladesh faces. But let me just, point to a couple of things before I conclude. The question that we need to ask is that, what can we do to kickstart growth and job creation in the near to medium term? And here it's useful to look at the GDP by the expenditure composition. So we know that GDP is basically consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. So let's break down that identity here and try to understand what can probably kickstart growth and job creation in the near to medium term. If you look at the top left graph, what you see is that consumption has been a very important driver of GDP growth in Bangladesh. However, at present, given the state of the labor market, given the decline in real wages, high inflation, and uncertainty, consumption growth can expect to be fairly muted and therefore unlikely to kickstart growth or job creation in the near term. If we look at exports as a share of GDP, now this, as we all know, has been a very important driver, again, of growth and job creation in Bangladesh. But as we can see from these statistics, exports as a share of GDP have been falling over time. The ready-made garment sector, which has been the most important driver of exports, has been facing severe challenges, particularly since COVID, on account of disruptions due to geopolitical tensions, because of rise in trends of nearshoring and friendshoring, increased competition from Vietnam. And looking ahead, there are even greater challenges for exports given the concerns that are emanating from the imposition of reciprocal tariffs by the US. So in this background, it would be challenging for exports also to kickstart the economy in the near term. Next, let's look at investment as a share of GDP. Now, this, as even the White Paper Committee points out, has been fairly sluggish in Bangladesh. It's been private investment as a share of GDP has hovered around 23% of GDP. And this is because of a variety of well-known constraints of challenging business environment, misallocation of credit in financial markets, inadequate infrastructure, high costs of energy and transportation, shortage of skilled labor, and so on. So these are the usual suspects. But what I want to highlight over here, looking at the other two graphs, is that it is possible that there is a new constraint which is going to emerge in the context of investment, and that is going to be the lack of demand. The lack of demand, here I refer both to domestic demand as well as to external demand. The domestic demand, specifically consumption, because a revival of consumption in large part is going to hinge on a recovery in jobs and income. And this in turn will depend on a revival of investment. So there is a very worrying circularity between investment and demand, and breaking this vicious cycle is something which is going to require a lot of structural reform and macroeconomic reform to kickstart growth and job creation. So what do we do in the near term or the medium term? In this background, the only variable that is now left in the identity, the GDP identity that I told you about, the C plus I plus G plus net exports, is government expenditure. So in the near term, we can expect government expenditure will need to do the heavy lifting to drive growth and job creation till private investment and consumption recover. Now, what specifically government expenditure? We can again discuss this in more detail, perhaps in the discussion section. But two quick ideas here. One is employment intensive infrastructure projects. Of course, there's been a lot of focus on infrastructure in Bangladesh over the last decade, mega projects, but allocating that infrastructure investment in a manner that actually gives the maximum bang for the buck in terms of employment generation assumes significance at this point. Therefore, the focus on employment intensive infrastructure projects. Secondly, another idea that can be explored is the introduction of a public works program, but one that is specifically targeted towards youth and women, given that in the trends that I have highlighted so far, it is youth and women which have borne a disproportionate burden of the labor market challenges in this period. Now, let me look at the GDP data now from the production side. And here, this is a very well-known story. We all, this has been highlighted by many people who are perhaps sitting in this conference room. Several organizations have written reports on the need for more broad-based and diversified industrial growth. It is well known that the growth story has been excessively reliant on the ready-made garment sector. The graph on the left is just one example to highlight that, which looks at the share of ready-made garment exports and total exports. So, of course, there is a growing recognition for the need for an industrial policy that will facilitate growth beyond this sector, which looks at leather and leather goods, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, electronics, jute, tourism, so on. Many sectors have been identified. However, what I want to highlight, I mean, this is well known, but one more thing which needs to be looked in conjunction with this is that when we talk about a diversified and broad-based industrial growth strategy, it is not enough to simply talk about a strategy, a sectoral strategy that looks beyond the ready-made garment industry. We also need to think more carefully about the firm size distribution. Interestingly, the GDP statistics, they actually break down for the manufacturing sector and tell us what is the share of output that is coming from large and medium industries and what is coming from small industries. And this graph is really quite striking because it tells us that a disproportionately large share of manufacturing output is coming from large industries. So this having a broad-based, a diversified, and a dynamic SME sector, in particular, small and medium-sized enterprise sector, also becomes very important. This is also important because many of the bottlenecks that I spoke about in terms of accessing finance, credit, and so on, they are far more severe for the SME sector, while large firms can circumvent many of these challenges. Now, these are just some ideas that I have put forward, but I think the bottom line, and this is what I also caught in the last presentation, was that whether we're talking about employment intensive investments, or we're talking about a public works program, or financing of a new industrial policy to spur growth and job creation, all of this is going to require a supporting macroeconomic framework. What do we mean by a supporting macroeconomic framework? What I mean here is really a pro-employment macroeconomic framework. What that essentially entails is that the macroeconomic framework will need to look beyond its traditional role of driving growth and of enabling macroeconomic stabilization to a transformative role where it focuses also on the employment challenge and doesn't simply treat employment as a byproduct of the growth process. Now, this is not an easy task for any economy to do, especially Bangladesh, given that it is faced by a confluence of macroeconomic challenges at the moment, and there will be several trade-offs that will be encountered. Many of the reforms which are aimed at macroeconomic stabilization may well exacerbate labor market challenges. Just as an example, higher interest rates to address the challenge of inflation, which in fact erodes real wages of workers, on the other side creates a challenge of reducing access to credit for SMEs and hurting job creation in the SME sector. So there will be various such trade-offs that will arise. Similarly, fiscal cuts could also have implications for job creation. So the macroeconomic challenges or the macroeconomic policy reforms will have to be very cognizant of the fact that they don't exacerbate labor market challenges and instead seek to be pro-employment. And this will actually require that macroeconomic and labor market challenges will need to work together in tandem to advance decent and productive employment growth. And one key element I want to highlight here is that financing all of these activities is going to require much greater fiscal space, and it is going to require far greater domestic revenue mobilization in the economy. And as you can see from the graph which is on the right, if you look at the Asia Pacific region, the tax to GDP ratio for Bangladesh is much lower. It's second from the bottom at about 7.5% compared to all other economies in the Asia Pacific. So there is an urgent need also to expand fiscal space, and that will very much have to be at the heart of macroeconomic policy, to expand fiscal space to support job creation and growth. And while I've spoken on macroeconomic policy and labor market in this slide, but we can again get into more discussion in later on how trade and industrial policy will also need to be integrated in this framework, and all of these will need to work together in a coordinated manner to advance decent and productive employment growth, specifically for the youth in Bangladesh. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, I think it's an excellent presentation by Dr. Radhika. She has identified or most of the challenges that we have and also provided some recommendation which we'll further discuss by this very distinguished panelist. I think we will give 10 minutes to each panelist for, and then we'll open the floor for taking some question. And then we intend to finish it by 6 o'clock, so we have 60 minutes from now on. So I'll start with Dr. Iyanatul Islam, who is actually okay. We have discussed that he will talk towards the end. Okay. So Dr. Iyanatul Islam was with ILO. He was former branch chief ILO at Geneva. Now he's also adjunct professor Griffith Asia Institute, Griffith University, Australia. I think we are not imposing any direction to each of them, but I have a suggestion that or request that you can, while you discuss, you can also focus some of the issues with relating to youth and female employment in the context of Bangladesh.
Thank you very much, Chair. Greetings to all of you. I'm obviously delighted to be here, and I thank Sanim, and in particular, Professor Salim Rehan for inviting me. I'll start with a disclosure, and it's an embarrassing one. I'm not going to talk about Bangladesh as such. The reason being that I have been away for more than 50 years. I've never worked in Bangladesh in a serious way, and so I'm going to bring in a global perspective that combines my academic background with my role as a former ILO official, where I was able to engage with constituents in different countries across the world in terms of policy advisory services. The title of this session is Setting Labor Market Priorities Right, something like that, isn't it? And I would like to respond to that by saying we have to set the priorities in labor economics right. Now you might say, what does that mean? Well, as economists, the first thing we learn when you do labor economics, or what we call Econ 101, when it comes to the labor market, there is a single, simple proposition. And that proposition is that workers and employers have equal bargaining power. Now, if workers and employers have equal bargaining power, then there's nothing to worry about. There's no need to worry about unemployment. There's no need to worry about de-skilling and so on and so forth. There's no need to worry about gender disparities. There's no need to worry about child labor. There's no need to worry about forced labor. There's no need to worry about unsafe working conditions because they're taken care of by this assumption of equal bargaining power of workers and employers. And so ILO is irrelevant, isn't it? Because any regulation that is imposed on a world in which there is equal bargaining power is bad regulation. Now you might say, I'm making this up. I'm not. It's not too long ago. If you go to the 1990 World Development Report, it clearly says regulating the labor market costs jobs and impairs the living standards of workers. So that is why I think we need to be revisiting how we approach labor economics, because it is in the domain of labor economics that labor market policies emerge. It does not emerge like manna from heaven. So if you want to justify minimum wages, if you want to justify the need for safe working conditions, if you want to justify policies in Bangladesh and elsewhere in dealing with gender disparities, if you want to justify the need for reducing working poverty in Bangladesh and elsewhere, we need to have an analytically robust and empirically credible labor economics. Now, where will that come from? Because the first-year textbooks and other books are dominated by this notion of equal bargaining power of workers and employers. We have rediscovered that there is such a kind of labor economics. And that labor economics goes back to the 1930s, based on a famous book by Joan Robinson. Now, Joan Robinson was a female economist. She also had a very assertive personality. And so there was a misogynistic reaction to her presence that made it difficult for her to actually propagate that idea. So that idea was lost. For many, many years, nobody really paid serious attention other than a section in a textbook, which we call monopsony. That is, employers, whether we like it or not, have monopsony power that allows them to abuse their privilege to exploit workers. Hence, unsafe working conditions, hence the incidence of child labor, hence gender disparities, so on and so forth. So the idea that we should regulate the labor market and uphold labor standards is not merely one of moral imperatives. It is now rooted in sound labor economics. Now, where does that come from? Where does the new labor economics come from? After you travel to the most recent period, there's a famous book that came out in 2013 by Alan Manning from LSE called Monopsony in Motion. Good bedtime reading, try it. And that is among the most cited books, and that is where labor economics of the sort that we would like to see, where regulations matter in changing the welfare of ordinary workers, whether you're employed or self-employed, is rooted in sound empirical evidence. What did Joan Robinson discover? She discovered that if you have monopsony power, then you will be deliberately paid wages below what you deserve. If you have monopsony power, employment will be lower than what it otherwise would be. Now, unfortunately, even someone like Arthur Lewis, Nobel Prize winner, one of the most cited articles, Surplus Labor, believed that development meant going to a world where there's equal bargaining power between workers and employers, or which he called the neoclassical labor market. So the whole idea that I have in mind is that we should revisit labor economics before we are able to reset labor market policies, because they should be derived consistently, rigorously, from an analytically robust empirical framework, which we call the new labor economics now. What's the evidence? Well, I come from Australia, that's where I live now. There is a term that's used in Australia which also applies to Bangladesh, and that term is called wage theft. In other words, workers are deliberately underpaid. Deliberately underpaid. And that happens in the university sector where I belong to. Now, why does that happen? Why is there wage theft in the Australian university sector? Because the internal labor market of the university sector in Australia resembles that of an army of vulnerable workers who work as casual labor or on fixed-term contracts. And therefore, they have very little employment security, and as a result, they're exploited, underpaid, often deliberately. Fortunately, there is a recourse and redress because there is a court system that imposes fines on employers who can be detected in engaging in wage theft. So think of a country like Bangladesh, and all the problems that we face is really due to the fact that we have vastly unequal bargaining power between workers and employers. That is the fundamental challenge. How to resolve that bargaining power using appropriate regulations is really the challenge that we face. Everything else, of course, can be taken care of through macro policies, industrial policies, and so on and so forth. But the issue of bargaining power can only be handled by appropriate regulations, on which now there is ample evidence that they work. There is considerable evidence that minimum wages work. there is considerable evidence that upholding labor standards work. And that, Chair, is my message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ianutul Islam. We should start with making the right labor economics in Bangladesh, possibly. I think 2 points are interesting. One is that the bargaining power of the workers. And I think I'll come back to Qazi Iqbal, the last one. Okay. So given that issue, and we know that like the worker safety, workers' rights are really, really poor in Bangladesh or weak in Bangladesh. And I think Syed Sultanuddin Ahmed has been working on these issues quite extensively. So I will request you to discuss the issues, and also if you can highlight these issues of bargaining power, the possibility of bargaining power, worker safety in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And thanks, Sanem, for organizing these types of very useful program and panel for this and inviting me. I followed Radhika's presentation, and also Dr. Yassin pointed out that collective bargaining is most important instrument and for the equal balance and the labor market policies and everything. So if you go to reality, rightly says that priority is right for Bangladesh. Unfortunately, Bangladesh labor market policy, employment policy, all are dictated by the international organization for the last decades, many decades. So whenever they draw any policy, we got a telephone that we want to interview, and the consultant is from another country, and he and she has her own mindset before she start any discussion the policy. I'm sorry, I'm not particularly mentioning or undermining anything or undermining the international consultant. I'm saying that the title is very good, right for Bangladesh. If I just pointed out 2-3 things, as Radhika mentioned, that 50% increasing number of the own account workers. And you know that 85%, more than 85% are informal sector workers, and within the 85%, our own account workers are now increasing. And who is this worker? We can see in every street of the Dhaka city that how educated youth are actually riding motorcycle for ride share. So they are all educated youth workers. Women, declining of the women percentage in the RMG sector. And where they drop, they actually drive to the rural women areas, most vulnerable working areas. And none of them have any collective bargaining rights. They don't have any actually labor law coverage. In Bangladesh, all the labor law coverage are actually limited within the very few formal sector. And within the formal sector, there are more than now 50% informal workers, those who don't have any rights. If you see the agency recruited workers in the government offices, in ministries and everywhere, where even women workers, agency recruited workers in the same level, same job, everything, in the same office, the permanent workers got the maternity leave 6 months, but the women workers recruited through agency don't have any maternity leave. She needs to take leave break for the 2-3 months if she wants to go for. So this is the regulatory framework for the employment and right. And we don't have any employment ministry. We have employment ministry, but no employment department there. When we are a student, we have the employment exchange, government employment exchange, where you can register if you are unemployed, and if, recruiting agency also can, industry can register also. Now we don't have. So first of all, we need to actually change the landscape of our regulatory framework of the employment and labor rights. Otherwise, everything will be for the limited people. We need to universalize at least some issues, some areas. Minimum labor law coverage for fundamental rights of the workers, especially their appointment or their recognition as a worker. They may be day laborer, but there should be a database and there should be recognition of the workers. And then a minimum standard of wage, national minimum wage. Whatever we have, that is for sectoral workers, and they're all for formal sector. So a domestic workers don't know actually how she will claim. Even sometimes employers also don't understand that how she should pay for them. And there are, I'm just giving an example of the domestic worker. There are others also. So there is no actually social security or social protection for any workers in this country. Whatever the scheme we have, government says that they are using 5% of the GDP budget and everything. That is actually for ultra poor, and that is spent, and most of the portion go for the government pension and retirement benefit. So this is the one area that how we can change our total legal landscape of the country, especially regulating the labor market and workers' rights, so that each and everybody can have the right to organize and represent themselves, bargain collectively with their counterpart. This may not be employer. For own account worker, it may be community, it may be local government, it may be government department. But that they should have right to represent themselves. Like migrant workers, they should have right to talk with their own industry, ministry and everywhere. There is no right to them to represent there anywhere. So this is one area we need to deal with, that whatever the condition of work, employment pattern and everything, they should have right protection of some areas, some fundamental areas. Another one is actually coordinated effort. We cannot make it say, please remind me if I, we cannot reform the labor rights or right priorities for Bangladesh, priorities for right for Bangladesh in isolated way only for labor regulation or labor reform or economy. It's actually related with the skill development, as Radhika mentioned also, related with the education, youth education, and coordination between industry, association, and academic and skill institution. We don't have this. When this declining of women workers, actually the data came that it's due to because of automation. There are many other factors, but one of the factors is automation. We tried to talk with the industry that what happened? Why don't you, is there any map from the industry and interaction with the government that this is the tendency, we are going to introduce these types of automation in next 5 years, and we need to arrange retaining of the workers or alternative training of the workers, those who we cannot adopt the skill and everything. They say no. And then when we check with the National Skill Development Authority, they are saying also they have different projects and everything. But it's not like that academic institution, industry will give the requirement to the Skill Development Authority. Skill Development Authority will give the requirement to the academy, institution, and there will be some association, workers and employers association should be interact with this thing to identify their future needs and to train them, even nationally and internationally, which is lacking also. So when we say that, ensure the rights, prepare this future generation, future workers, potential workers for their rights, that is also important. And their right to get skill retaining in the job. That is, I think, one area we need to discuss for the right priorities. And if I conclude that actually rural and urban differences and discrimination. In last 2-3 months, I am actually consulting with many groups of people because of the Labor Reform Commission recommendation to prepare the recommendation. The discrimination and the vulnerability of the workers in Bangladesh, I don't think that it's anywhere in the society it is exist. And without this, we cannot this. Industrial practice, just giving one example, a small example, I will conclude. If you see in around Dhaka city, this Gazipur, Tungi, Sabar and others area, we are now developing many resorts, luxury resorts for seminars, symposium and everything. And if you pass through the road, going to that resort in Gazipur, you will see jackfruit are actually rotten in the roadside. There is no jackfruit research institute in this Gazipur area, or any factory where you can process the jackfruit and employ the workers. So this is the policy gap. Actually, I should not say policy gap. It's just ignoring the main situation of the country, especially when the question of youth employment and women employment and the labor is coming, and try to build a rosy picture by building road, building and everything. Everything is okay. My last thing is that I don't know what angle actually Radhika mentioned that formal paid job is a good job. In Bangladesh, it is not. Is formal paid job even a bad job for even below poverty line? So this is also we need to ensure that without a living actually salary, living wage, we cannot make a decent job for anybody, and that should be for everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Much. I think you talked about, which I was thinking also in terms of living wage, and in the Radhika's presentation, we saw that real wages have been falling. I think we need to arrest that and change that, but I think it's also a tall task in the context of Bangladesh. I will now move to Dr. Qazi Iqbal, Research Director, BIDS. He was also part of the team who has produced a white paper. I think he has some concrete example also. But I think one issue that Radhika talked about is a pro-employment macroeconomic policy, which is interesting, but I think also very difficult to actually form. And if Qazi can provide some share on that also while.
Thank you, Sanem, for inviting me. This is an honor. First, I would like to make a few comments on Radhika's presentation because she nicely summarized few stylized facts, identified few problems, and also some way forwards. So first, I will shed some light on that, and then I will try to complement her presentation with some evidence that we generated in white paper. Then also, I will touch upon the main issue that this session is about, that is labor market priorities from my research. Okay. First, I'd like to talk about the increased feminization of agriculture that she talked about, and we already know that. The share of female labor force participation has increased from 36% to 43% in the last few years. And this happened in self-employed agriculture sector. So what's actually happening? I think this is kind of at odd with our observation with increasing gender-biased technological change in agriculture. If we look at the agriculture, we can divide in few tasks, right? As like in tilling and tasks which occurred in the field and the tasks which occurred at house. And what are the tasks that are being mechanized over the last few years? Tilling, it has been mechanized for the last 10, 20, 30 years, right? And the thing that has been mechanized in recent years is threshing, some grinding, and some other post-harvest management. And these are the things that are used to done by the female workers. So it is the female workers who are supposed to be replaced by this mechanization. But when you see the LFS data, it shows that the number of female workers in agriculture has increased. So we find it a puzzle why it's happening. So I think this is something that we need to look at very carefully. I'm sure data may be an issue, and there is maybe something going on that we don't know, but this is something that we need to look at. This is one thing. Second is very related. Why there is a decrease in manufacturing labor, is a drastic decrease in manufacturing labor where the share of output has increased over time. It shows that there has to be some technological progress. But if we look at the technological progress in the main industries like RNG or pharmaceuticals or some other industry, do you see that kind of technological change that can explain this kind of reduction in employment? I think no. Again, I think there must be something happening that we don't know. It could be data or it could be something else, but we don't have the answer. Again, there is a similar argument for RMGs that the increasing gender-biased technological change, that means females are being replaced by the male. There are some evidences. There are some evidence in case of like knitting garments, because we found that there are some machines in knitting, because of jacquard machines, something like that. It runs 24 hours. It runs in two shifts, day shift and the night shift. And what happens that in the night shift, there are no female working in the night shift because for other reasons, because of gender norms and other things. So the number of female just dropped because this machine runs in two shifts. So these are the reason why machines are replacing female. It's not that these machines require more masculine power or more male power. That is not the reason why females are being displaced here. So this is something that we need to look at more carefully again. And now I'd like to add a few points on graduate unemployment, because this is something that is very relevant in our time. And we know that there are three major problems in our labor market. First is creating new decent jobs for the graduates, enhancing their employability in the labor force, that is skilling up them. And third is reducing the mismatches in the labor market. And all these problems are very acute for the graduates. And if you look at the data, you see that the number of the unemployment rate for the tertiary graduates was 5% in 2010, and it is about 13% in 2023. So it's more than doubled the rate of unemployment. But why it happened? It is both because of supply side and the demand side problem. There is an oversupply of tertiary graduates in Bangladesh. Oversupply of tertiary graduates in Bangladesh, which is incompatible with the structure of the industry and incompatible with the structure of the country. Because in the labor force, the share of graduates was like 3.5% in 2010, and it increased to about more than 10% in 2022. The share of graduates in the labor force tripled. And what are the source of these graduates? It's mostly the tertiary colleges. In tertiary colleges, there are like 1.5 million in 2010. It increased to about 3 million. 3 million tertiary college students enrolled in our country. Okay? So it is because of these tertiary graduates, there is a huge unemployment problem in our country. And why it happened? Why? Because there has been an aspiration of the people, right? A rising aspiration that they want to be graduate. But there is no enough technical colleges in our country. And if you look at the numbers, there are only 149 TSC and only 110 TTC. TSC means technical school and colleges, and TTC means technical training centers in our country. Those are publics, but those are very few in numbers. So what's the policy decision here? So it requires that we have to shift a large volume of tertiary graduate students from tertiary college students to the TVET stream. So this is a big challenge, how we can do that. So I don't know, it's a $1 million question, but we need to do that. Otherwise, we cannot solve this graduate unemployment problem. About coming to the labor market priorities, I think Radhika already mentioned a few. I just want to compliment her. I think it is important to talk about TVET and skill development when you talk about the labor market issues, because it requires a substantial government investment, which need to be expanded to the union level so that access to these TSC and TTC increases. And also the current model of polytechnics, TSC and TTC, it is very expensive. And I saw one number in some newspaper that it requires 80 to 100 crore taka to build one TTC and TSC schools. So we need some indigenous low-cost solutions for this. And these TTCs and TSCs TTC only target high school graduates. That means after class 8. So we need some targeted programs for the primary schools dropouts too, and primary school students and the dropouts too. And one more thing that is very also important that we found is the demand side interventions. Still, there is a huge social stigma about these polytechnics. So I don't know how to do it, but there has to be some mass campaign in media, creating a few role models so that people can evaluate them. And also there has to be some kind of social recognition of these TVET graduates there. And my second point is about female employment. Radhika touched upon this female employment, just I want to compliment her. with the note that we need to create non-farm jobs in the rural labor market for female. So look at the rural labor markets. What are the jobs that are available for a female? Few school teachers, NGOs, maybe banks. That's it, right? Very limited opportunities for a female who passed, say, like class 10 or class 12. So we need to create some job opportunities at the local level. So this may like incentivizing RMG factories to locate in rural areas, maybe some public investment in rural areas, so that which will create demand for female laborers. And also it asks for the removal of structural barriers for female in labor force participation. By removing structural barriers, I mean building, say, like female hostels in every district, some low-cost daycare centers so that the mother can put their children there while going to work. My third point is about the labor market governance. This has already been discussed. I have some couple of points that I'd like to add. One is, even the 2018 amendment does not adequately protect the rights of the informal workers that you mentioned. The child labor issues has not been adequately addressed in the informal jobs. And the last point that I want to add is that the mandatory internships. There is a provision that industry with 50 workers or more are supposed to have 10% or 20% of their workers as interns. But this has never been followed. This has never been used in our labor market. But this is something that we can go ahead with that. And the last point is about the data issues. We know that the following ILO's definition, we use anybody engaged in productive works for pay or for profit, or own use consumption or unpaid family workers working at least 1 hour in the last 7 days. This is a very loosely defined definition of employment. In fact, I'm wondering why not 100% people are employed in using this definition. This is an important, this definition may be important for cross-country comparison, but for policy perspective, this definition is completely useless. We cannot use this definition. So I think I would request ILO, Bangladesh, and BBS, if they can generate some measures of employment which we can use more effectively, like engaged in employment in the last 20 hours a week or 40 hours a week, or something like that. I can finish here, maybe I can come back later if needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kazi Iqbal. I think few issues came out, like TVET issues, skill development, supply side issues are very important. Also, you talked about trying to finding an indigenous low-cost solution, which is also very important. And I think data issue we also talked about, like from the ILO, like this is an issue that employment, underemployment issue, measurement is always an issue. And also like the skill, trying to find out like what are the skill level of the workers is always a difficult one. We have to use a proxy, like education, which may not be the correct one. So I think since you are here, one of our requests is to see whether it can be incorporated in the next rounds of surveys. We can take some questions from the floor now for a few questions, and then, yes, Madhav? Please identify and be specific, okay?
Thank you so much, sir. My name is Mahtabuddin. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Manchester and assistant professor of economics at the University of Dhaka. I'll be very brief. It's a kind of a comment more than rather than a question. The comment is that the discussion or the presentation that we have seen today, it misses a couple of points, like Kajibai was mentioning, like it missed the child labor. But what I found, like we always miss one particular very important point: the discussion of the persons with disabilities. Like in our discussion, we do not talk about people who are suffering from the mental or physical disabilities, or what happens if they find any kind of, if they face any disabilities or accident at their workplace. Also, we don't talk about the marginalized groups, like the tea garden workers and their well-being, their wage, all those issues, or the ethnic minorities. Then another thing, I think it's very correlated with the topic, like the issue of the child marriage. It seems uncorrelated, but you see, 51% of our children, they get married off before they turn 18. And there are many papers those shows that it is highly correlated with their job market, labor market participation. And lastly, another issue is that the female labor participation rate, the thing that we talk about in Bangladesh about just joining the labor market. But what happens about the females, they join early, but they leave too soon. Like they join at the age of 15, but they leave the labor market when they turn 30 or 35. So you see, if you see the age, you will see as the age progresses, they leave the labor market. So we might have to talk about their, not only their participation, but sustaining the female labor market sustaining their participation in the labor market. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Ahmed, retired academic and policy researcher. I would like to pick up, thanks for a very broad-based discussion and pointing to some of the problems and solutions. Pick up where Dr. Kaji Iqbal left about the definition of employment. I think that definition, if it is necessary for inter-country comparison, at least there should be some provision to suggest the depth of disguised unemployment or some definition, some unemployment definition in terms of full-time equivalent terms. So it can be guesstimate or some sort of, you can have a survey somewhere and assert that this is what is happening. So if it's done consistently, then over time we can have a bit of a sense where we are heading to. So that's one suggestion. Again, on Radhika's presentation, I was a bit, I think I'm missing something, because when I look at the sectoral distribution of employment and GDP, I've done very rough calculations, but I brought 3 sectors. They don't add up to 100. So something is missing there. So if you can explain that, that would be good. In terms of, again, on her presentation, government has to do heavy lifting, but if you look at the share of employment directly by government, it's very trivial. So some sort of clarification, I think she explained it. So if I were the policymakers, I'll be looking at which sectors have got the broadest and largest linkages with labor-intensive labor participation. So if the government can encourage those through some sort of incentives, that could be one way of looking at it, rather than directly engaging through public works and things like that. So I think she's suggesting Keynesian stimulus, but it has to be labor-focused. I think that's probably she was suggesting. Some clarification on that would be good, great. In terms of, I haven't heard much in terms of how we are dealing with the employment in informal sectors. I think that's 80% of the labor force in urban areas. So some discussion on that would be good, some policy prescriptions. In terms of, sorry, I'm taking a long list. The last one, about the feminization of rural labor market. I'm not sure, I'm not a labor market expert, but microcredits, which is very much female-focused, would that make any difference in terms of turning a self-employed female, from being a household or backyard gardener? Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you, sir, to giving this opportunity to ask a question. I'm Hussaindat Hassani, a research scholar at Goa University and from Afghanistan. So I would like to ask from Dr. Islam that that is true that the bargaining power of the workers and employers should be equal through regulating the labor market. But we know the main problem in developing countries is that the supply pressure. So, I mean, there is a lot of workers who want to be employed. And we know that the productivity of workers is different. So, how, even if we regulate in the informal sector, the share of informal sector is large in the developing countries, in countries like Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan, this kind of things. So even if we have a good role in regulation regarding such kind of things, it is very difficult to, isn't it difficult to actually to adopt or to implement this kind of regulation in such kind of countries? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm Atanur Rabbani from University of Dhaka, teach at Department of Economics. So thanks to Inad Bhai for mentioning the Econ 101. I think I could frame it a little bit differently, but I'm not there. But I would probably, so there's a movement in Econ which looked at the labor market as like the competitive market as a special case of broader market that can take place. And that's actually interesting framing, because under that condition, if the market is not competitive, minimal wage can actually have very different type of implication. I think that's something what you're alluring to. Yeah, so, well, you didn't use the word competitiveness. So I think that's interesting. I think that's also very kind of related to many of the minimum wage that people advocate. I think that's a very different framing, and I just wanted to, like, that's very interesting point. Two things I want to mention in terms of kind of statistics. One thing that Dr. Qazi Iqbal Bhai has already mentioned. I think our unemployment figures just don't make sense. It's always 4%. And like, what kind of magic are we talking about? And it also doesn't square with like 47% of the youth are unemployed. I mean, talkative youth of this rumor probably won't be, will find difficulty finding employment. That's a different story. So, sorry guys. So I think that's something that we really need to address. And I think we should work with Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics and kind of just figure it out. Second point is something that Radhika mentioned, is the productivity. And I think labor productivity will increase, but they will not be able to reap the benefit. I think partly because our education just sucks. I think if we don't invest in our human capital, and it can be skill capital, the one that Dr. Qazi Iqbal has mentioned, but I think that's something in a country with like 2.5% of GDP going to education, public education, and we are expecting the employment problem, labor market problem will be solved. It's another magic that we are just waiting for, which will never happen. So I'll just stop there.
Hello everyone, I'm Maisha Ahmed, currently a student of Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. Actually, my question is for Dr. Qazi Iqbal sir. Sir, you mentioned social stigma about polytechnical colleges. So the reason behind this could be that people are not aware or not shown enough example of them progressing in their field. So what do you think can be done to remove this stigma and make the students more interested in pursuing a career here? Thank you, sir.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. My name is Shafkat Shafiq. I'm currently studying in health economics at the Institute of Health Economics in Dhaka University. So we already have a framework, if not the best, at least have a framework for the formal sector. For example, we have Department of Inspection for industries and other Department of Employment. But I think what's missing is the whole sector in the great prevalence that we currently have an informal sector, and which is most prevalent in our country. So starting from the plastic recycling sector to the waste pickers and a huge sector and other sectors which actually are in the informal sector. So what can be done to formalize this and to regulate this so that they can be ensured their proper rights and the proper amount of real wage that they're getting? That's all.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Muhammad Asim Hossain from the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. My first question is directed to Sir Sultan Uddin Ahmed sir. As you have touched upon the distinction between formal and informal economy, so for Bangladesh, what would be the right combination of those economy, keeping in mind the trade-offs, like for you to have a formal economy, you can get the benefits of regulation, but informal economy has way much less red tape. So what would be a perfect combination for appropriate for Bangladesh? And my second question is directed to Dr. Qazi Iqbal sir. The sociological aspect of people preferring to pursue graduate studies is that the highest the job that people mostly aspire is it has the requirement of pursuing your undergraduate studies in the BCS or bank jobs. So that could be a contributing factor. And as we know that the administrative roles, they are eating a lot of our labor surplus. So what measures could be taken to improve their efficiencies? As we know that in the industry, especially in the corporate world, there are many types of regulations. Yes, I'm coming to that. So there are measures such as quarterly evaluations, easy access for reporting. So could those measures be implemented in our bureaucracy? So what is your assessment of its feasibility that using those measures would be beneficial for the labor market? Thank you. I hope I'm able to deliver my question.
Namaskar, me from Nepal. After observing the presentation of Dr. Radhika and one of our panelists also, they have clearly illustrated that actually the picture they provide us, they show us the actual picture of the unemployment and paid employment, and one of our panelists also suggested the major causes of unemployment, graduate unemployment. After observing this, I have a general question that what could be the driving factors to motivate paid employed, female employed, and the unemployed graduates to shift into the self-employed so that they could be the big entrepreneur in their in their coming days, even they started from the small ones today.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions from the floor. So much for your participation. I will request the discussants to respond for just 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll focus on two questions that were addressed to me by a gentleman from Afghanistan and also Otanu. Sorry, did you ask a question to me? No, you did not. Yeah. So you gave the impression that the problem of regulation is something that is really a challenge in developing countries and poorer countries and not in rich countries. Well, the news that we can share now is rich countries are just as bad, in the sense that you also have something like 0 hours contract. In other words, you're given a contract, but you're not given any assurance of work. So it ranges from 0 to 40 hours. That is a contract you actually get. So, and I already told you before that in the university sector in Australia, there is something called wage theft. You're deliberately paid low wages because it is populated largely by casual and fixed-term workers who provide teaching services. So that's my point. So don't lose heart. Rich countries are just as bad in many ways. Otanu, your point about framing, yeah, I didn't use the word competition. And the problem with us as economists is that we grow up with competition as an ideology more than a robust analytical construct. And what we now know from the literature, primarily from the work of Alan Manning and his colleagues, is that one of the best ways to analyze the labor market is to assume that there is extremely unequal bargaining power between workers and employers. When you assume that and validate that empirically, then all the notions about ILO-type advice on minimum wages, labor standards, reducing gender inequality becomes really, really relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. I think a few, 3-4 questions are targeted to me. The first one about the role of microcredit in feminization of agriculture. I think microcredit has been around for the last 3-4 decades, but what you talk about the increase in female labor force is a very recent phenomena, so it doesn't explain why there is a recent jump in female female labor force participation by microcredit. That's number one. About the social stigma, yeah, we need large-scale social engineering for this. Some kind of behavioral group may work on it. Some kind of maybe social recognition, creating a few role models. There are some standard tools of social engineering that we can use, and I think we need to create some groups who can work on it. About the mismatch aspiration, why youths are getting into graduate school. Yeah, I think it's a failure of information market, I think. Because if you look at the entry-level salary of the TVET graduates, which is much higher than the entry-level salary of the tertiary graduates, but people are going to tertiary colleges more than the TVET graduates, and also the waiting period is much less then. So I think this is an information failure, and I think if you guys are interested, you can do some RCT on this, giving some information provision and whether it works or not. Thank you. Thank you. I think there is only one question to me. And in general, already the combination of the formalized and informal sector. As I mentioned, that there should be a minimum core standard which should be covered all the workers, irrespective of their sector, appointment, and everything, and which include what he mentioned again and again, that right to represent, organize, and collective bargaining. This should be core area. But another one, that there is a very direct action plan to progressively formalizing the informal sector. And when we say formalizing informal sector, in Bangladesh, the all policy says that formalizing the business, but business should be with the workers also, enterprise with entrepreneur and workers together is enterprise. But very often we actually mark that, okay, enterprise means the entrepreneur, and we support them to grow and formalize. It will not work, so it needs to be taken together. That may be another way we can formalize this thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are almost at the end of this session, like it's almost 6 o'clock, 10 minutes to 6 o'clock. I think now we can hear from Tomo, the ILO perspective. He has been working in Bangladesh for long, almost 8 years? More than 8 years. So, and he has been provided support to BBS and data collection, data generation, also instrument for a lot of strategy and policy development. So I think we can get a real picture also from him. It's what's actually the real challenge for employment generation in Bangladesh.
Thank you. And I think you all have spoken to the real picture. And I think you all quite lucidly understand and have put forward the problems as we understand them, right? And of course, looking at the last 10 years or so, I think we all understand and appreciate that the so-called growth has been predicated very much on export industries, garment industry, the huge infrastructure investments, and also the labor migration and the remittances that actually have not been very much talked today, but also form part of employment, because it's clear that the past administration and perhaps even the current continues to see labor migration as one exhaust valve for employment, even if that employment is abroad. I think you've all put your thumb on many important things, and the discussion has been quite broad. And I think from ILO perspective and from the UN broader perspective, it is quite high time that when you think about future, you do indeed put employment-rich growth at the center of the thinking on Bangladesh going forwards. And we've lamented over the years, and I think some of the think tanks and other organizations have also lamented over the years, the lack of a coherent employment policy and focus. There's been a lot of talk about employment, either in relation to trade, either in relation to skills, either in relation to labor migration, even SME development, as we all understand that SMEs actually have been carrying most of the employment creation in Bangladesh. But there hasn't really been a concerted effort as a policy to zoom in on quality of employment and where the jobs would actually come from, right? Even the various 5-year plans, their chapters on employment have been very slim. You find employment everywhere, but nowhere, right? Everywhere, but nowhere. So I think that's really what has to change. And I think the discussions like we have had today, they touch on employment elements of that. Some of you have spoken about the informality, and I totally agree that formalization cannot be just enterprise-focused. It has to be also work and worker-focused, right? Some of you have touched on the fact that whatever policies and whatever considerations there should be, it should be predicated on leaving no one behind, thus making sure that issues about youth, school-to-work transition, rural economy, Chittagong Hill Tracts, and indigenous people and minorities, people with disabilities, and so forth, have to be also considered in these policies. Many of you have talked about the need for investing in human capital development. Thus, one of the fundamentals that also has not been properly invested in is investment in education and truly bringing forward modern, skilled Bangladesh. What I mean by truly is you invest in the right kind of labor market investments, which means you work with the private sector to make sure that you understand what kind of skills are needed. You modernize the existing investments in all levels of primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And you do need to have modern quality TVET institutions. And most of them have to be at a higher level. So technical colleges, even vocational universities need to be invested in. And you have to do that with private sector. The private sector has written off skilled Bangladesh a long time ago, because they don't see that the people who come from the education system, be it primary, secondary, tertiary, qualify for those jobs. So they have to train them, they have to retrain them, or they have to hire them from outside. And that's a loss for Bangladesh youth. And that's why I think some sort of a reform, true reform, together with the private sector, that starts to sort of create those real pathways for young Bangladeshis, boys and girls, to find the quality jobs where they exist need to be looked into. And we've said over the years, and we continue to say, it doesn't matter how many factories you build, it's not going to create employment in the numbers that you need, right? So the employment creation, the focus on employment creation, and that's what I think my colleague from who was giving the presentation was talking to. The heavy lift has to perhaps come from government initially, but it has to be complemented by understanding better how the private sector and the foreign investment can help to create that employment creation. And in that process, rural economy, SME development, self-employment, be it urban or rural, and really working together with the industrial policies and export promotion policies to create those right pathways is something that has to be done. I don't think that my colleague was talking that government has to employ people. I think she was talking more to the fact that the initial wave of employment programs needs to use existing government resources to generate that employment. Like, let's see, what is one of the biggest employer or indirect employer? It's the LGED. It's kind of like the local economic development authority, all those investments, all those contracts that do the roads and bridges, that do the maintenance of work, right? If that is thought through from an employment creation angle, if every penny that is borrowed is also thought through from an employment creation angle, and not just low-cost employment creation, but quality employment creation and creating jobs for men and women in equal terms, then that goes already a long way, right? And we all understand that during the previous administration, that was not exactly what happened. You know, the quality was not the angle. It was just to get a lot of things done as cheaply as possible, right? So you can change policies. You can think differently in terms of how government investments and borrowed money is utilized. So these are a couple of things that I think come to mind. The ILO's view on all of this is that you need to have strong laws and standards, because without those, and it goes to what you were saying, any of these measures doesn't really function, because there's no trust, there's no rule of law, there's no order, right? So that's why we talk to labor standards or labor laws from our perspective, right? But you need to also have that dualism of employment creation that reduces inequality and produces quality jobs. And if that, for whatever reason, does not immediately happen, then you have to have universal social protection to be able to balance the books, because you want to have a society that reduces inequality and produces what we call increasingly, and I believe you do, social justice. You know, social justice where all Bangladeshis, boys and girls, young and older, have the ability to be productive and enjoy the fruit of their labor, right, in a way. And in that last area that we believe in ILO is simply the fact, and it goes to this issue of collective bargaining and this issue of representation, you have to have an equal playing field. And in that equal playing field, the workers and the employers need to be able to come together and to discuss and to bargain and to understand the growth the same. So it goes, maybe it's the Australia in the university sector, maybe it's some other sector. You know, there's no always fairness, but you have to be able to talk to it. You have to be able to represent your views and interests. And last thing I wanted to say about one of the key things for young people and for generally is that this country will not be able to kind of like go forward very well if the women's entry to the labor market and if the imbalances in terms of, and the barriers for women not to be able to enter labor markets, but also to enter vocational training, to have any job they like in equal way, if not, is not addressed. There is no job that is different, that the women cannot do or the girls cannot do. They can do any job that there is. And that mental block that exists still in terms of that women or girls should not be in this kind of a job or that kind of a job, we just have to somehow overcome that. And that's like a social issue, that's like a norm, like a cultural issue. But Bangladesh needs to continue to work on that and make sure that women and men and boys and girls will be able to enjoy equally the labor markets. So just a few comments on that. And thank you, Sanem, for inviting us here. I think it's truly important that there are these kind of discussions and that you all promote this kind of idea of coming together and having employment as a real central piece of your reforms going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tomo. Excellent summarization. I think towards the end, I think I have to say something. So I think this has been a very engaging discussion. I think it started with a very insightful presentation by Dr. Radhika. She has highlighted the major issues, major challenges in the context of Bangladesh labor market, and also provided a few suggestions in terms of going forward, basically based on demand-side policies, and also talk about a pro-employment macroeconomic policy. We like to hear more from her in terms of what could be the element of the pro-macroeconomic policy, which can be be tested in the context of Bangladesh. And I think all of the discussions talk about differently, but I think all these points are very pertinent. Anil Bhai talk about, Ianul Bhai talk about starting a right labor economics, which also Atunu commented on that. I think from the floor, we also got very good suggestion in terms of, Qazi Iqbal talked about in terms of like the skill issue, and try to find out an indigenous skill, the low-cost solution, which is very also important. And there are also mismatch between the skills that required by the industry and what is actually produced by the education sector in Bangladesh. And also, Syed Sultan Uddin Ahmed talked about like the rights of the labor and the weakness of the collective bargaining power in Bangladesh, which are very important. And I think one important issue came out that, which I like very much, that in the 5-year plans, in the perspective plan, we talk about more on everywhere on the labor, but nowhere actually. That's a very good, interesting point, and that's an important point. And I think also I like your point that we should possibly focus to develop a coherent employment policy rather than focusing on 5-year policy or growth policy. So let's try to see, and I think this Professor Wahidin Mahmood also talked about that we should try to see less on growth, more on employment generation. So possibly, I don't know whether, I haven't read the, I have chance to read the white paper, but not the strategy paper which has been just been produced. So I think we can take some element out of that, but possibly we can think of how to produce a coherent employment policy, looking into near policy, medium term, and long-term policy. And I think also we can think of how I think the budget will be near, and we can see whether the government is putting some of the elements of the budget in terms of at least short-term employment generation that is lacking now. And with that, I like to conclude and thank you everyone for participation, and special thanks to discussion and our special guests. Thank you.
We thank the brilliant panel for this session. The next session, which is the last panel discussion of the day, will start now. It is on the topic, Unpacking Bangladesh's Economic Resilience. The presentation will be given by Dr. Salim Raihan, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Dhaka, and Executive Director, SANEM. The session will be chaired by Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhuri, retired, former Foreign Advisor, Caretaker Government of Bangladesh. Clinton Poke, Deputy High Commissioner, Australian High Commission, Bangladesh, will be the guest of honor for the session. The distinguished panelists for the session would be Dr. Fahmida Khatun, Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue, CPD, Dr. Lailiful Yasmin, Professor, Department of International Relations, University of Dhaka, AKM Fahim Mashroor, Co-founder and CEO, BD Jobs, and Pavez Karim Abbasi, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, East West University. We request everyone to kindly take their seats. The session will start now.